Welcome back, everybody. Just so you know, we're not alone. Scott has just told me that we are trending number 2 across Canada on Twitter. And just to reassure you that we have the right credentials, Christian has already taken a selfie of the panelists up here. So the last panel really launched us into this panel in a wonderful way, raising all sorts of questions about how things are changing, how technology is impacting giving, how younger Canadians are responding quite differently to the whole concept of charity and giving. And so that's where we're going to take the discussion now. And as before, rigid discipline on time. The last panel was so good, it seems to be completely internalized now. But Sarah, you start off.
Hello, everyone. My job today is really to set the stage for what this panel is going to be talking about today in terms of who are millennials and what are their implications for charitable giving. So millennials are the Canadian generation born between 1980 and 1995, which means that currently they're roughly about 21, 22 to 36 years of age. And I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many in the room today are millennials by that definition? Okay. There's a number of you here. And really, you are a very popular group right now. Very, very sought after. And that's really comes down to numbers, because right now in Canada, the two largest generations are the boomers and the millennials, about equal numbers, about 9.5 million each. But over the next couple of years, as the number of boomers begins to decline, the millennials are going to become the largest generation in Canada. And that means that there's a lot of people out there that are trying to figure out who millennials are, what makes them tick, what do they want as consumers, what do they want as citizens, as employees, and how do we reach them in terms of being potential donors. And there's been a lot of, I think, media attention to this, and it depending on the day or the publication that you're reading, you can read an article that says that millennials are ambitious and they're connected and they're socially conscious and they're tech savvy, and the next day you can read an article about how they're entitled and they're lazy and they're narcissistic and impatient. So how do we parse all this? And I think one of the problems is that there's a tendency to want to paint all millennials with the same brush and define them as kind of a single cohesive group based on their date of birth. So instead, and what we've done is we've taken a different approach. Instead of looking at them from a demographic perspective, we've taken a social values approach to looking at who these individuals are. And by social values, I mean the underlying orientations or mindsets that we have as in terms of approaching the world and in terms of approaching other people, how we see the world around us. And doing that has allowed us to actually define 6 different segments of millennials according to their social values. And by doing that, these tribes allow us to make sense of that diversity, allow us to kind of understand why one millennial fits into one segment and therefore differs from another segment. And what that means for how we communicate with them, what words we use, what language we use, and how that resonates. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all the different segments. What I've done is put a summary sheet on each table so you can take a look at the tribes, and there's a web address there with more information about each of the segments. Excuse me. What I would like to do today is just break it down into 2 kind of groups to talk about what we know about those who are most likely to give, and therefore look at those who are less likely to give and what are the implications for that. So the 3 segments that are most likely to give in either times in terms of time or money in the past 12 months are engaged idealists, critical counterculturalists, and new traditionalists. And there's some values that underlie all those segments that kind of make them a natural fit for charitable giving. One is that they're highly connected. They're very engaged with their families, with their friends, with their communities. They are involved in something bigger than themselves. Another value that's kind of common to those groups is social learning. They really believe that they can grow personally and learn through their relationships and interaction with other people who come from different places in life than them. And the third value is about personal control. They really believe that they can control their own destiny, and what they do will make a difference. And so that's where you can see that for those three groups, there's a natural fit with charitable giving. It just kind of makes sense with their thinking and the way they approach the world. What's interesting is that those three groups are only about a third of millennials. So in fact, the other three groups that I haven't yet mentioned form the majority of millennials, and they are the ones who are less likely to be giving, according to our research. So the question then comes is, how do we reach each of those? So for example, I'm going to use the diverse drivers as an example. So what do we know about that group according to their values? Well, we know that for them it's all about making it. They strive, they really seek success. Social status is really important to them. They're very ambitious. They crave respect and recognition from their friends and family, from the people that they know. And so that's just a thumbnail sketch, and there's a lot more information available on that group. But what we're looking for then is, what's the hook to draw them into charitable giving? And the suggestion in our research is that potentially it's prestige that is actually making a difference for this group, that if they can use their charitable giving as a way of building their social status or showing some kind of cachet, that's going to make a difference. And I'm kind of side-eyeing Kirk here because I know a little bit of what he's going to talk about. But the diverse drivers are only about 10% of millennials, so maybe this is something that's going to work for them that isn't necessarily going to work for the other groups. And so if there's a takeaway for what I've been saying in these 5 or 7 minutes, is that millennials are not a single cohesive group. They're a diverse group of people. And the implication, therefore, is that, number one, it's useful to understand which group it is you're trying to focus on. Are you trying to go after all of them? There's likely some groups that are going to be more welcoming or open to your message than others. And once you've decided who you're going to target, use the information that you know about those groups to help you create a message, create an approach to design a language that's going to resonate with that audience.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So, important question there is, it's not a single group, although we put the label on that whole generation, I guess you could call it. But in fact, it's more complex than that. Kirk, you've been given a good introduction here.
Well, so yeah, Sarah, that was great. So I think that there likely are a lot of differences. I'm going to talk more about the group in general, and my focus is going to be on the role of social media and how this integrates into charitable giving among this group. And social media is a very visible vehicle, and it's also being used very extensively by millennials to engage with organizations and with causes that are important to them. But it's not just millennials, because nonprofit organizations and social causes are also using social media extensively, both in terms of social media campaigns and tactics. Now, these campaigns are great at raising awareness for an issue, but one of the underlying goals behind them is to engage with and generate more forms of support that help the cause. So be it financial contributions or volunteering one's time. Now, it's very easy to engage on social media, right? It's the click of a button. And given how easy it is to provide this type of what we call token support, and how many campaigns are out there, we were wondering, well, do these campaigns work? Are they effective at generating this more meaningful support that organizations need to fulfill their mission? And so, for example, if I like a page on Facebook, or if or an organization's page on Facebook, or if I retweet information that a nonprofit has sent out, is that going to motivate me to take that next step and provide that more meaningful support, whether that's through a donation or volunteering my time, or activism, right? Or is my support going to stop once I click that like button, or slow activism? And so we took an experimental approach in our research, and we wanted to investigate this question. And so we ran a series of experiments, both out in the real world and in our lab when I was at UBC. And we wanted to figure out, do these campaigns work? And so we gave individuals an opportunity to provide what we called token support for an organization. So whether it's social media, also pins and ribbons and signing petitions, this type of behavior. And then at a later time, they were given an opportunity to provide this more meaningful support for a cause, so a financial request or volunteering. Now, I will say there is, I should define it. When I use the word slacktivism, what I'm referring to is this willingness to give this token support, right? The liking pages, things of that nature, but then an accompanying unwillingness to take that next step and provide the more meaningful cause. So when I use that term, that's specifically what I'm talking about. And there is reason to believe that these campaigns can be effective. So, for example, many of us have heard the term the foot in the door. And what that means is that when we agree to a very small request, then we're much more likely to agree to a larger request, right? We've already agreed once. And so we're in. But inherent to these token campaigns in social media is that they're very public in nature, right? And research shows that when we behave in front of other people and when our actions are being seen, it activates another motivation, this impression management motivation that we have, or this desire to present ourselves in a positive way to other people. And so we reasoned that this might factor in to understanding the effectiveness of these campaigns. And so, for example, let's say that I like an organization's page on Facebook that's a conservation organization, right? So I likely do that because I do think that it's a good cause, right? And I can make a difference. Now let's say that we are all friends on Facebook, okay? So you see this. You log in the morning and you say, okay, Kirk has liked this organization. And you think, oh, good for Kirk, right? He's trying to help out. He's trying to make a difference. Now you have no idea whether I've actually made a donation, whether I volunteer my time for that cause, but you assume that I do because I've provided this public token support, right? So on the one hand, I have this motivation to help. But on the other hand, I have this motivation to look at other people. And in effect, by giving token support, I've satisfied this motive that I have. And so we predicted that satisfying this motive might actually hinder this following through process of providing more support. And so like I said, we ran a number of different experiments, and that's what we found. And we found that for individuals that gave public token support, they were actually no more likely to follow through and provide this more meaningful support than individuals who only received a larger request. Okay? Now conversely, it's not all dire. If you're able to make the token support slightly more private, right, or slightly less observable to other people. So think about connecting more privately on social media. Think about signing petitions where one's name doesn't show up, right? What that does, according to our data, is that turns us a bit more inward. It reduces and removes this other motivation that we have. And when we give this token support, we base the secondary request more on our own previous behavior. It's like, well, I supported before, so I guess I really do believe in this organization, and yeah, I'll follow through. And so that was, the first big takeaway was that, in the current public forums, which many of these campaigns are, they may not be effective. But then we thought, well, there has to be some time that they're effective, right? Because I think we've all, I would say, participated on some level in a campaign of this nature, right? Whether it's with physical symbols or online. And we think that it does work. And I think that for organizations, at least the ones that I spoke to through this research, there is somewhat of an intuition that it works. And we do find that it does, but only among individuals who are already highly emotionally connected to the cause or to the organization. So think about nonprofit organizations that focus on a specific health cause, right? So the people that these token campaigns, these public token campaigns are very effective for are those that, for example, maybe have a loved one or a close friend that have experience with that specific cause. So that does beg the question, though. What are these campaigns there to do? If they're there to raise awareness, okay, that's effective. But if they're there to generate new support and new engagement, such as what we are trying to do with this millennial group, then what our data suggests is that in their current public forums, where there's no call to action, these campaigns may not be as effective as we think and plan for them to be.
Kirk, thank you. Thank you. So we've talked about the growing importance of the millennial generation, but another group in Canada, which is growing in size and importance, is new Canadians. And second and third generations of new Canadians. And so I'm going to ask Christian, what are we seeing in terms of trends and attitudes towards giving among new Canadians, and particularly in relation perhaps to changes from parents to children and on to the next generation and so on?
Social media is a big deal. And in fact, I'd like to just share with you a very brief story. So I am a fundraiser. I've done this work in post-secondary for many years. And I came across an individual who is comfortably a millennial. And all of our interactions prior to our very first meeting were on Facebook Messenger. And we continue to build our relationship via Facebook through communicating through various means, both sending each other articles, sharing little snippets of information about what's happening both at the institution I was working for at the time and what's happening in his own life. And on our third meeting, he signed a considerable gift agreement, and he's an immigrant, and he just turned 32, and this happened many years ago. And what it got me thinking a lot about is the role of social media as a communication vehicle to engage people on a very intimate level, not just en masse. And since then, we've done a number of different things, and he's quite an incredible and committed, generous donor to a number of different charities. Not that everyone should approach him by Facebook. I'll talk to you later. But, I spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about the role of new Canadians, particularly high net worth immigrants in our sector, and how they are contributing to the making of Canada, remaking, imagining of Canada. And one of the things I did in my PhD research was spend time with some of those high net worth donors and individuals, fundraisers, chief executive officers of large charities to understand what their experiences have been like working within these new communities. And I learned a lot. And one of the things that I learned that really sticks with me and I think plays a huge role in the work we do is the way in which we think about charitable giving as an act of belonging to Canada, but also perhaps even belonging to the places people come from. And the ways in which charities have evolved, particularly on the marketing side, regarding how we are positioning ourselves as global leaders, not just local or national leaders, is something that we can't take lightly, and something that immigrants in particular are taking very seriously. How do we talk about the work we're doing in terms of our global reach? And in terms of philanthropic dollars, the flows are considerable. $53 billion philanthropically transferring across borders by migrants. And that adding to the role of remittances is really huge, $320 billion annually flowing to families back home and communities back home. So if we think about the role of Canada in global philanthropy and the emerging story of global philanthropy, we are really important players because of our diaspora communities. And so in thinking further about high net worth immigrants and what they're doing to maintain ties back home, build new networks here, I think often about how I got into this business of fundraising. I remember I was born in North York, Ontario in 1977. So I think I'm a Gen X, although sometimes some people call me a millennial. I look like a millennial, I think, I hope. But, one of the things that I remember is my mom and my dad taking me in their car to knock on doors to raise money for the grade 8 grad trip. I wasn't in grade 8, but I had to raise money for the grade 8 grad trip. And it was cold. And I thought, why am I doing this? And so I asked my dad, why am I doing this? And he said, do you want to belong? And I said, yes. He said, I do too. And so we're going to do this. And I'm going to take that pledge form and I'm going to take it to work because all my colleagues are doing this too. And so for me, it was a really important moment in understanding who I was as a Canadian through fundraising, through that exchange. And so, gosh darn it, I became the best fundraiser there was in grade 7 and in grade 8. And here I am today doing this work at Ryerson University. So, you know, that notion of belonging is very important, and connecting to that cause that was spoken about at the earlier panel, I think, is something that we must cherish. And as I work in an institution, we often talk about the cause. And I'd like to give a little hat tip to my friends and colleagues and the students at Ryerson University. And I know that a former law dean will be really pleased to hear about what's happening in the post-secondary world with regards to giving at the grassroots level. So as many of you know, Ryerson University was one of the leaders in setting up the Lifeline Syria Challenge. And our students, both millennials and staff, many of whom are millennials, and our students, many of whom are Gen Z or I generation or whatever we're calling this next generation, came together, raised $4.5 million in a very short period, tried to set up 72 teams, ended up with setting up 105 teams, and brought together partners from across the post-secondary sector to do something about this major global crisis. And what was really interesting for me to observe and to, you know, play a bit of a role in was the ways in which not just technology facilitated the fundraising components, but how young people are really getting involved, rolling up their sleeves and doing something alongside liking, tweeting, retweeting, and posting. Really, at the end of the day, there is a heart, wallet, mind paradigm that we really do need to pay greater attention to. I also want to just make one more quick point, and that is really around the future. The future as it relates to our about the next generation, second generation immigrants. And so through my research, spending time with high net worth individuals who come from other places or were born elsewhere, I spend time with their children, many of whom are millennials and in some ways who are now heading up their family trusts and foundations. And there seems to be a struggle amongst those who who arrived as new Canadians and their children. Just over the last 2 weeks, I've met with 3 of them, and we've had some very spirited conversations about how mom and dad say they want to do a lot in Canada and do, but they also do a lot back home. And some of that is undocumented work or unaccounted for work. But at the same time, what they are saying is that we want, as the next generation, to really do something for Canada, to build Canada in a different way. And we want to bridge both new Canadians and the new Canada through philanthropy. So there's some really interesting conversations happening within the family structure about what is happening on the charitable side, particularly as some of these millennials who are running these family foundations or will soon be running these family foundations, talking about connecting new Canadians to Indigenous communities and sovereignty issues around global issues on food security. And these causes that resonate with all of us in this room and on the ether here is something that we can really rally around. It kind of cuts across the new Canadian first, second, third generation question. So
thank you. Thank you, Christian. I love those stories. That's restoring my confidence. Ilona, we've given you a wonderful entree because you've spent many, many years looking at other dimensions of giving, ways in which people, young people especially, engage in their communities. What are you seeing?
Well, I just want to start off by saying that millennials are actually getting old. I'm a millennial, and I am creeping ever closer to my 40th birthday, which is terrifying, of course. And I think what we need to recognize is, yes, engaging millennials is important, but we also need to look to the next generation, which is Generation Z or iGen, but it sounds like Generation Z is what we're going to be calling this generation. So I don't think we have too many I know we have at least one Gen Zer in the room. So this is folks who are 19 and under. And I think it's really important that we think about not just millennials, but also the progression of changes that are happening in generations. So a lot of the realities that we've seen with millennials actually started with Gen X and are going to be continuing and amplifying with Gen Z. Now, the work that I do with the Youth and Innovation Research Project at the University of Waterloo actually looks at life stage versus a generational analysis. So yes, there's a lot of things we can learn when we look at a specific cohort or a specific generation, but there's also something we can learn when we think about what was true for all of us when we were young. So what our project does is we look at 15 to 25-year-olds and really try to think, okay, in the context of our modern society, of what's going on around us, how can we reimagine the role of 15 to 25-year-olds in society? What can that look like? And what do 15 to 25-year-olds have to offer to our communities, to our organizations? So we're just about to release a new academic article that looked at neuroscience and developmental psychology and makes the argument that young people from 15 to 25 are at the height of innovation potential. Basically, this is the period of life where it is the easiest for us, given heightened neuroplasticity in our brains, it's the easiest for us to come up with bold ideas. It's the easiest for us to challenge the status quo, challenge why things have been the way they are, to be creative. It's the height of creativity. It's also the height of risk-taking. And we tend to think of risk-taking as something negative. So when we talk about young people and risk, we talk about reckless driving, drugs, drinking. But when young people, researchers tell us that when young people think about risk, they actually are thinking about the positive kinds of risks that they need to take in their lives in order to get good grades, to do well in school, to get that job they really want to get, or to make a difference in their community. That's the kind of risk that young people are thinking about, and that kind of risk is incredibly important if we want to advance our organizations and address societal problems. So from 15 to 25, when we talk about brain development, we tend to say, the narrative in the media has been, well, our brains don't fully mature until we're 25, so young people should learn while they're young, and after they're 25 and their brains are mature, then they can contribute to society. But the reality with our brains is that they're changing throughout our lives. And there are some abilities that we have that actually start declining by the time we hit about 24. So if we wait until young people reach this arbitrary definition of maturity to encourage them to meaningfully contribute and engage, then we're actually missing out on abilities that they only possess while they're young. Now, there's an important other side to this story, which is so we did a study of 35 years of youth-led impact in the Canadian context. Both my research colleague, Dr. Amelia Clark, and I were young leaders ourselves, and we really wanted to say, okay, what lessons can we learn from former young leaders that we can share with this current generation of young leaders that will help them be more impactful and that can help us better support them. And what we learned is that the key to meaningfully engaging young people, and I would argue that this goes to giving as well, if we want young people to engage in our organizations and to connect with the causes that we're all about, we need to create strong intergenerational partnerships. So young people have impact, social impact, our research has shown, when we connect the bold ideas that young people are naturally their brains are wired to have these bold ideas, but we connect them with decision makers like all of you who are able to scale and implement their incredible ideas. So it's the implementation. There's a lot of barriers when we're young to implementation that we really need to figure out how to address. So we have a lot of big changes happening in society. We have an aging population, and that's going to be a context in the Western world that we have to figure out how to address. But also we're certainly in a period of rapid change where things are changing. And I would argue that the charitable sector, when it comes to engagement, but also when it comes to giving, and I think we certainly heard this on the panel this morning, needs to stop reacting and start being proactive. And how can we do that? Well, I don't think we can do it by starting on social media. I don't think that actually works. And certainly it sounds like the research backs up my feeling on that. We do it by changing our organizations. We do it by meaningfully engaging the next generation in the way in our structures, as was mentioned this morning, in the way our institutions are operating. We connect generations within our organizations so that those bold ideas, that innovation engine that young people represent in all of our organizations is something we're tapping into, and we're using that to really fuel the way we're addressing the social issues that we're talking about, but also the kinds of ways that we're engaging young people, whether that be with giving or whether that be other kinds of engagement. So we do that by creating these intergenerational partnerships. We also do it through what I like to call meaningful mentorship. So it's moving beyond the typical idea of how we think of mentorship. It's about not being afraid to encourage young people to surpass us and to do better than we did. So I'd like to just end off with a poem by Rupi Kaur that I think really, it speaks to what I think this work is all about. Our work should equip the next generation to outdo us in every field. This is the legacy we leave behind. So how, as a sector, can we do that? How can each of us individually create the spaces in our organizations, but also the spaces at conferences like this? So it's not just experts speaking, but that we're truly giving over the microphone and to that next generation who will surely have bold ideas that we can't even imagine that are going to help us address the issues we all care about. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilona. So we've been given a very interesting challenge because we started off, or maybe I started off, thinking we're going to be talking about givers, donors. What motivates them? How is their behavior changing? And really, we've come full circle, and the question is asked, us. How do we have to change? What shifts in our organizational culture, as Conrad mentioned this morning, or in the way in which we organize ourselves, the way in which we engage younger people? And to be indiscreet, if we look around the room, we might say that that challenge is very timely. So, let's open it up to questions. Let me first ask, is there anything specific that one of you wants to ask one of your colleagues up here? And if not, we'll go to the group.
I had a comment,
A comment.
but not a specific.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that I thought was absolutely fantastic is that each one of us researches using a different type of method. And I think that that's so important in terms of understanding both a broad spectrum of behaviors, but then also being able to drill down and get into more of those richer conversations and understanding the various segmentation within this large group, and then seeing what happens in the brain, right? I mean, I just think that that's so important from a research perspective to be able to cut across a single method, to be able to generate a much more richer understanding. So
That's great. Thank you, Kirk. And it reminds us that we all work so often on intuition, on anecdotes, but actually there's a very rich body of work being developed. And we need to be much more tied into that if we want to be able to make the necessary adjustments. So, questions? Yes.
First is addressed to Kirk, and I'll invite you to maybe speculate here. I'm interested, you've looked at prosocial behavior in social media. So if for a moment we think of the opposite of internet trolls or of the tenor of social media commentary, I'm reminded, for instance, that the CBC at one point in the last year disabled its comment fields for all journalistic treatments on Aboriginal issues because the tenor was so base that it just wasn't appropriate for our public broadcaster. And Conrad talked about the fact that for many millennials, the temptation often is to use Facebook or a public place to engage in a sign of protest or a simple complaint. Whether it's a troll or it's a justified complaint, I'm just interested in your speculation as to what the tenor of the discourse on the internet does both to pro-social behaviors, including giving or engaging, or even to the broader sense of belonging, or to the symbolic, again, back to Conrad's comment, the trust that is invested in the charities, the organizations themselves, or our sector as a whole.
I mean, great topic, great question. Now, you're right, I don't have data to speak to that, so it would be just based on some comments. In terms of the negative behavior, I think that the online world, be it social media, be it, comment sections, I think that there's an element of being able to hide, even though our names could be there, our pictures could be there. I think that we may say things, and I say we because, the social setting can change all of our behaviors and does change all of our behaviors, right? Not to say that anyone would engage in those sorts of comments. But I think this slight reduction in accountability and being face to face with somebody could enable some of those negative behaviors and comments and awful things. I mean, we've all seen, whether it's on the news or read in the paper, of some of the terrible things that are said on various issues. And my feeling is that the online world can facilitate that, unfortunately. I do also have a little bit of faith, though, on those public channels that people do get called to the carpet. I mean, we're also recognizing now, and I mean, this is pushing the limits, but the type of even harassment that happens is criminal. It is, right? And so there's ways now that people are being held accountable for those sorts of behaviors. No, that's not where you went with the question, but I have faith. Even though I talk about slacktivism, I'm a positive guy. And I do think, though, that when that behavior happens, there is accountability both by the public and by the law. And so I'm hopeful that different norms can become established, and that behavior will not be tolerated. That's just my commentary on the overall topic. Great point, thank you.
There's a really interesting website that was developed several months ago called Rage Donate. And what Rage Donate does is take really enraging comments by people, popular, very famous people, and listen, you'll have to go on the website to know what I'm talking about. And what it does is ask people, are you mad about this question or this comment or this assault? Donate to that charity, Civil Liberties Union, or anyway. It's a really fascinating way to bring together activism, one's values, and philanthropy in one click. And so check it out. It's mind-blasting, as Russell Peters says. That's a great way to channel.
All right.
That's
Question over here.
Danielle from the CAMH Foundation. And Alona and Kirk in particular, I was thinking you might have answers to this, but Krishan and Sarah might as well. This dichotomy and this intersection between a feeling of digital and technology and social connecting us And yet some of these insights about not going there for action and this idea of slacktivism, sort of impression management, not action. But then we see a few moments of action, like ALS, the Ice Bucket Challenge, where all of a sudden we saw sort of a less known charity sort of go gangbusters. I'm just interested in your insights or perspective on that as a potential case study, or the seeming contradiction between this feeling of connectedness and that sort of action in the real life, and how we sort of use these to amplify.
I can start. So I think amplify is actually a great word. So often when I give presentations about young people and how to think about social media, I frame it this way. So if any of you, have been invited to an event on Facebook, you go and you click and you say, yeah, I'm going to go to that event. Where, generally speaking, now there are some virtual events, but where does that event usually take place? It usually, anybody? It takes place in real life, right? Like right?
Physical place?
A physical place with other real people. And often when we talk about digital, we tend to kind of get stuck in the digital space, and we forget that there's actually a really, really important connection between online and offline, right? So I talk to, I'm old, right? So I'm not on Snapchat, but so I talk to my friends on whatever social media app that I like the best, but then I actually hang out with them in person. I'm not making a date to hang out with them virtually. So I think with the Ice Bucket Challenge, what was really cool about that is it asked you to do something in real life, right? You had to go and you had to pour a bucket of ice and cold water on your head. That is very physical, right? And in a way, I think it allows us to connect more clearly with the cause. So I think it's important that in whatever campaigns we're doing, we recognize that there needs to be the online component, but also an offline component. And I think social media can amplify engagement, but as a first step, and it can also open the door, but as a actual motivator to take a real first step, it's not actually that useful. So when you want to engage with young people, go and talk to them. And if you want to know how to engage with young people, go talk to the young interns who work with you, the young employees who work with you, your kids, your friends' children. Talk to them in real life and ask them how you can meaningfully engage with them.
So I completely agree with all that. What I will say, and just because you mentioned the Ice Bucket Challenge, I think that it does kind of fall into so you're not right. First of all, we're not saying we are completely. I think that was a very, very interesting campaign. Hugely successful. I mean, the amount of money that was raised is absolutely incredible and wonderful. What I will say is I will make the argument that in the initial stages of that campaign, it was slacktivism. Think about it. It was, instead of making a donation, pour ice on your head, and then and then ask other people to do the same thing. And in the beginning, and if you look at the donation rates, you can actually, there's almost a point about 2 months in where it really changed. And that's because the behavior changed. And it was more about tagging your friends and getting them to do it than it was about connecting it to making a donation to the cause, because that's what the cause needs. It needs money. Money funds research, right? But then there was a fantastic change in that we started to see these videos that before the individual did it said, I just made a $500 donation to ALS. That's what you need to do. And now I will pour ice on my head. And organically it changed. And that's a different behavior than what we looked at, right? Because that goes from just showing the video to your friends in a fun way to dump ice on your head to connecting the behavior, a call to action. And then it was not slacktivism. Then it was very, very successful. And I think that it's a wonderful example to see how important it is. And again, I haven't done any experiments on different calls to action, but anecdotally that suggests that by tying in that desirable behavior with that initial token act, that's one route that you could start to enact change. So again, it speaks to the engagement. I agree. Combining the online with the offline, pivotal, right? But that was a really, really cool campaign. And when I started to see it, I thought, oh, wow, how does that work? And so I thought a bit more about it, and based on the data, that's...
So, Kirk, this is a perfect point to bring a question from online. Quel est le meilleur moyen de mesurer l'impact et succès?
What's the best way to measure the impact of the success of a campaign in the social media?
Which one of you wants to?
I guess everyone's looking at me. I'll flip it on you. That would be that would depend on the goal of the campaign. If the goal of the campaign is to increase one's volunteer pool, then I would say the number of volunteers that have followed through. If it's to raise awareness, and I just want to be clear, like, raising awareness is very important for an issue, right? And in addition to raising funds, awareness is very, very important. What we focused on in our research was, does the initial ask lead to more contributions, right? Volunteer. So we certainly weren't trying to say that awareness wasn't important. If it's awareness, then maybe it is in fact how many times it's been viewed, it's been shared. If it is financial contributions, I would say, well, is there an increase? So we have data, right, that's been published on the ALS, right? And we see this huge spike. I would argue that was a very successful campaign in terms of raising financial contributions in 2014.
Christian?
I just want to reference the earlier question around online engagement. And, you know, I have to say, from the perspective of new Canadians and those who have ties elsewhere, it's hard to do that on offline component to maintain those ties. And what we're seeing now are some tremendous relationship building activities across borders, across time zones, because of the power of technology and social media. And so I'm really quite curious about how we might be able to leverage those technologies further to increase our reach for philanthropic charitable purposes, and vice versa. I've also been thinking a lot about the role of the Canadian diaspora globally. You know, we talk about immigrants coming here, but we also have so many Canadians who live elsewhere. And how can we continue to increase their consciousness about what is happening in their homeland, its connection globally to where they are today, and how we might be able to leverage technology to be able to continue to solidify those relationships. Because our immigrant community outward is also a very important community that we are continuously underrepresenting. But in terms of measuring success online, I agree that it really depends on the goals of the campaign. But I also think it really depends on how we advertise on those platforms. You know, what the study the really amazing, incredible work that you did really talks about it at an individual level as well. And charities as organizations or as entities are using the opportunity to promote advertising, really, about their charitable work in very good ways. And we see that many of you are leading the charge in that way for Canada, and perhaps even internationally in the global north. But that said, it really is also thinking about Facebook and Twitter not just as democratized, individualized series of platforms, but really it is a platform owned by some, managed by a few, and run by us. So we have to think a lot about that orchestration. What is served up to us on Facebook? You know, all of these culinary, for me, I get all these culinary charities to the right of my screen because I love to look up recipes on evenings and weekends. And so, you know, how does that influence what we see, what we know, and what we give to? Very important question to ask in this time.
Alors, juste un impact que je pense c'est vraiment...
One impact is important. about social media campaigns is the changing of policies. I believe we can change how we think about a specific topic, but also we can change the way we can change policies. If we use social media in that context, it can have a strong impact.
To pick up on the ALS campaign and just to make a comment, it was really interesting to me. I don't have the numbers on this, but the ALS campaign brought in a huge number of new donors. How good a job have they done at maintaining that donor base? In the private sector, we always talk about, bringing on a client. Keeping them is actually less expensive than bringing them on a new client. So that's another factor here. How can we use social media? How can we communicate with millennials that once we've brought them in the door, that we can keep them engaged, that we can keep them involved in our cause?
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. Last question. It's just we wanted also on the media.
While I was thrilled to hear about the topic that you each were speaking about, what I was more heartened by was that you all are doing research on philanthropy. As a fundraising practitioner and as the person who runs Ryerson's fundraising management program, Tim, you touched on it. We need to connect more to the research that's going on. The challenge with research about philanthropy is that it's being conducted by such a wide diversity of disciplines. Neuroscience, well, Christian's actually a fundraiser who did research on fundraising. That's kind of cool. But, we're seeing neuroscience, marketing, psychology, sociology, all doing research on philanthropy. My question is, how do we connect that research to practitioners so that it's easy? Because we're not doing it right now. We are not seeking out the research because we don't necessarily know where to go, let alone based on the fact that we're so busy doing our own jobs. So what's the magic bullet? Who's curating this in a really easy way that we can all just go and find it?
Each one a quick magic bullet.
I can do a quick one. So we, as pro-social behavior researchers, would love to work with you. So I would love the opportunity to test whatever theory I have in working with an organization. So for anybody that is interested, please, we would love that. One of the ways that we're trying to get it out is through the journals that we publish in. And many of the journals now are trying to communicate the research that's being published through the media, right, through social media channels, so that what is being done is communicated, so that we can have conversations. I mean, I was very, very lucky when my paper came out that it was promoted and I was able to speak to, because of the research, individuals in nonprofit organizations so that I could ask, why are you running these campaigns? What was the logic between X, Y, and Z? And to try and understand how, in a practical sense, you're putting into play, whether it's intuition, whether it's findings from research. And we would love to connect. That is one of the things that actually we find the hardest, is when we approach organizations, because we want to show with real people and real data. I mean, as an experimentalist, that's why we run studies out in the field and not just in the lab, because we need to see real behavior. And so if the opportunity were to come about, we would embrace it with open arms.
Sarah?
I think this is a very interesting question, given the first panel where we were talking about organizational capacity, and that's definitely an issue. And so I'm just going to put a shout out to Teresa and her team at the Rito Hall Foundation for what they're going to talk about this afternoon, is a foundation that's standing up to take on this idea of bringing together research and making it available to the broader sector. I think that's something that's going to help a lot.
I think the Governor General actually preempts the other panelists.
Well, Tim, I don't want to preempt, but I'm a kid in the candy store. You can't resist jumping into this discussion. I wanted to respond to that question because it's very basic, and it has to do with professionalism. And let me give a little preamble. I'm very interested in professions and very interested in the contribution that professionals make to the quality and the health of your society. You people involved in giving and fundraising are professionals. You have a set of skills that are quite unique and quite powerful. The three elements that makes up a profession are, first of all, it's knowledge, methodology, savoir-faire, that you're taking. And they tend to be somewhat rare. Not everybody has them, and you generally have to learn them. So that's point one. It's the knowledge base, huh? Point two is that professionals very often have a high degree of influence on who enters the profession. What are the standards of competency throughout that professional life? How one develops in the professional life, and also how one exits the profession, or how one deals with the aspects of less than professional conduct. And the third and probably most important element of a profession is a social contract, a trust between that profession and the public at large. And if the trust level is pretty high, the public at large will encourage element number one, become as knowledgeable as you possibly can, probably give you a degree of freedom to determine better. Thank you. I think it's Tim cutting me off here.
I wouldn't dare.
As my grandmother used to say, Tim, stand up to be seen, speak up to be heard, and sit down to be appreciated. But you apply that to the more traditional professions we know of medicine, of law, of engineering. When the social contract begins to weaken, when the trust element, and trust is at the basis of all of this, begins to fray, then the competency on element one and element two disappears. So now to come to your question, it's so important that practitioners of the craft and the art are working with theoreticians of the craft and the art and marry them together for all the reasons we've heard today. But I could summarize it by saying the most useful thing in the world is a good general theory, especially if you're constantly applying it to reality and altering it accordingly. And that is a continuous journey.
Thank you. Bullet answers, Christian and Ilona?
Well, what else can I say?
Good answer.
You know, one of the things that I've come to see is that philanthropy is also an imported value, and the study of philanthropy is also imported and exported across borders. There are places that do this very well because it's done with great intention and with a long-term plan behind it. We're ready for that. Canada is ready for that. And there are places and pockets where that is happening, at Carleton, at Ryerson, in various social economy research centers. But we need to test that theory in the field. And the work I do constantly tests my theories in the field, and vice versa. But I have to say that it is with the leadership of professionals and academics and practitioners coming together in the sector that we'll find some magic.
I just wanted, Ilona, just before you speak, I want to add to that list. In Quebec, there's the Institut Malais, which actually, on a consistent basis, every couple of years, brings together the researchers and the practitioners. And because it happens on a regular basis, it actually creates a growing body of knowledge. And there's also the Lab sur la philanthropie in Montreal. So there are some places where this is being done in a perhaps more consistent way, and there are other parts of the country which might want to emulate that. Ilona.
I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner who works for a university, and I'm certainly not the first one to do this, but I think this kind of model has a lot of promise. So my job is to collaborate on research with academics at the University of Waterloo, but also other universities, and then do what academics like to call knowledge dissemination. So I basically spend my time writing for the media, writing opinion pieces, speaking across Canada and internationally, and talking about the research in a way that hopefully is interesting and engaging. So I think we have work to do to create these kinds of partnerships, but they are happening, and I totally love what I do. I think research is awesome, and I love to geek out on it, but I also really enjoy the opportunity as a practitioner to engage with other practitioners.
Thank you. Apart from the fact that I wish Ilona wouldn't keep talking about her getting old, because that seems to bump me into another category, which is distinctly uncomfortable. But having said that, let me thank the panelists. Another wonderful discussion, and remind you all that these folks are going to be around for lunch. It's your responsibility to make sure they don't have a chance to eat. So don't be shy about pursuing them. And I want to invite Annabelle Cloutier, qui travaille avec l'Office du
who works with the Governor General's office, will tell you about My Giving Moment.